Thanks so much, Carol, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here back in Madison. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for being here. That Tai Chi was so relaxing. I hope I haven't just let go and forgotten my talk altogether. No, I was joking. Okay, let me just. Okay, so this was my original title. As I wrote the presentation, the title evolved a little bit. So the updated title is Health Disparities in an Era of Rising Income Inequality. So I wanted to start today with a picture. So here we see a picture of an airplane depicted in this political cartoon, and the inside of the airplane is changing across time. So what we see is that the front of the airplane is becoming increasingly luxurious over time, whereas the back of the airplane is becoming increasingly cramped. So this may be consistent with our experience of how airplanes have changed over time, but to what extent is this consistent with the changes that we're actually seeing in the structure of our society? So let's take a little look at the data and see how this maps together. So this chart shows inflation-adjusted income over time for 5 different groups of the population. So in this particular plot, we're breaking the population down into 5 groups, into 20% groups, from the top 20% to the bottom 20%. And we're looking at household income over time, from the late 60s all the way up to 2017. And it's important here that income is adjusted for inflation, because this really allows us to look at household income as an indicator of material affluence. So what we can see here is that for the bottom 60% of the population, there has been not a whole lot of change after we adjust for inflation in income over the last several decades. So pretty much a flat line for the bottom 60% of the population in terms of household income. And this is in contrast to the top 20%, who's seen really substantial increases in material affluence over time. So whereas around 1970, the top 20% of households were making on average around $120,000, once we get to 2017, it's more like $220,000 that top 20% is making. So really substantial changes in material affluence for that top group. The second 20% has had slight increases in material affluence, but in general looks a lot closer to the bottom 20%. So really it's this top 20% pulling away from everybody else, while everybody else is remaining relatively stagnant. So household income is an important indicator, and probably the most frequently looked at indicator of material affluence and its changes over time. But it also has its limitations. It's focused inherently on the household level, so it doesn't necessarily fully take into consideration changes in the size of households over time and the number of people contributing income within households. So it's important to also look at individual wages as another indicator here. So this is a plot again which breaks the population down into 5 20% groups. So on the left side is the bottom 20% of the wage distribution. On the right side is the top 20% of the wage distribution, with the middle groups in between. So the dark green bars represent wages in 1979, and the light green bars represent wages in 2016. So we're looking at how wages have changed over time, over this period of time, for each 20% group of the population. So we can see again that really the bottom 60% of the population again has shown really very little change over time in wages. So pretty much, and again of course these numbers adjust for inflation so that the purchasing power of the dollar is actually consistent across the 2 ways that we're looking at. So adjusting for inflation, we see really no changes for the bottom, very little changes for the bottom 60% in individual wages. And again, this is in contrast to the top 20% who've seen this 27% increase in their wages, with that second group again showing some increases, but not not really close to the top 20%. So a pretty similar story overall for wages as we saw for income.
Is that dual income families, is it single income, is it gender?
This is just individual wages. So this is not at the household level, it's just at the individual level. Yeah, and this is for everybody. It doesn't include, it doesn't look at gender differences. Okay, so another important way of looking at inequality in society is to consider the proportion of income made by the top 20% versus everybody else. So here we can think of the overall pie as representing all income in the economy as a whole. So if we take all of the income made in the United States in a given year and pull it together, that sort of represents the size of the total pie. So what we're doing is looking at what portion of that overall pie is, in terms of income, is made by the top 20% versus everybody else. So it turns out that in 1970, about 43% of overall income was made by the top 20%, and the remaining 57% was made by everybody else, the bottom 8%. In 1990, that proportion earned by the top 20% had increased to 47%. And by 2017, we kind of crossed a threshold here where at this point in time, the top 20% are now making more than half of the overall income, overall available income, and everybody else is making slightly less than half. So over time, we see these gradual increases in the proportion of the overall economy taken up by the top 20%, and a decreasing share available for everybody else. So if we look at the top 1% instead of the top 20%, we see a similar story, but even more pronounced. So here we see similar data but represented a little bit differently here. So we're looking over time on the x-axis, and again on the y-axis, the focus here is the total portion of overall income made by the top 1% is the red line, and the bottom 50% is the white line. So whereas in the mid-70s, the top 20% was making about 10 or 11% of the overall available income. By 2014, that portion made by the top 1% had increased to around 20 or 21%. So an increasing, you can see this gradual increase over time in the total portion of all income made by the top 1%. Across the same period, we see a downward trend in the total amount of overall income made by the bottom 50%. So around 1995, we reached this point where the top 1% and the share of overall income going to the top 1% actually surpassed the total income going to the bottom 50%. So since 1995 and onwards, the top 1% is making more than the bottom 50%, and that difference between the two groups is increasing over time. So really, the same sorts of trends exist if we go up the distribution from, if we look at the top 20% or the top 5% or the top 1%, we see a similar sort of pulling away from the rest of the group, and the higher up we go, or the higher we go up the distribution, the more extreme the trend is. Okay, so let's return to the original cartoon and kind of consider how the picture maps onto the data that we've just looked at. So the fact that the front of the plane had increases in material affluence over time seems pretty consistent with the data. Regardless of whether we define the top as the top 20% or the top 1%, it's pretty clear that levels of material affluence among that group at the top have really increased very substantially over the last several decades. The back of the plane, when we looked at income and wages, have actually remained relatively stagnant. So based on the data that we've just looked at, it actually might be a slightly more accurate depiction to actually show the back of the plane staying the same over time, while the front of the plane has grown increasingly large. It's important to note here that the overall economy has also grown. So this, in some ways, the size of the plane represents the size of the overall economy. So the size of the plane, if we were actually thinking of the plane as representing the economy, we would actually want to see a bigger plane over time. So it might actually be more accurate to see the plane getting bigger, with the back of the plane staying the same size and the front of the plane getting bigger and bigger. Okay, so one thing is clear, and that's that it's pretty good right now, and it has been getting better over time for the people at the top. So regardless of whether we define the top as the top 1% or the top 20%, it's pretty clear that things are going well for those at the top. But as the gap between those at the top and everyone else increases year by year, it's very likely that the journey from the bottom to the top could also be getting more and more difficult. And the chances of making it from the bottom to the top might be changing. So this is an important question that we wanted to consider in our research. So have we reached a point where we're starting to see changes in the influence of childhood circumstances on adult outcomes? So more specifically, are childhood circumstances becoming a stronger predictor of adult health outcomes? So in order to address this question, we used some data from the Midlife in the United States study, from the MIDAS study, and we used two samples that were collected 17 years apart. So the original MIDAS cohort was collected in 1995 as a broad age range of adults from 25 to 74 years old. A very similar study with the same measures and some added enhanced measures was collected 17 years later, around 2012, with the same age range. So essentially what this provides us with the opportunity to do is look at this association between childhood disadvantage and adult health in two independent random samples that were collected 17 years apart. So what we wanted to do was look at the strength of this association between childhood disadvantage measured the same way across the two samples and these four health outcomes measured the same way across the two samples, and consider whether the 2012 association was stronger than the association in 1995. So for health outcomes, we looked at functional limitations, which is an index of activities of daily living and how much somebody's health is influencing their activities of daily living. Chronic conditions, just the number of chronic conditions that somebody reports having been diagnosed with, whether it be hypertension, stroke, arthritis, and so on and so forth. Body mass index, which is an indicator of adiposity or obesity, and a global index of self-rated health. Okay, so when we compared the strength of these associations across the two samples, here's what we found. So the orange bars here represent the strength of the association in 1995, and the blue bars represent the strength of the association in 2012. So across all four of the health outcomes, it seems that childhood socioeconomic disadvantage is a stronger predictor of all four of the health outcomes in the more recent 2012 sample than it was in the 1995 sample. So as inequality in society is growing over time, and it seems that we may be becoming more stratified such that childhood circumstances could be becoming a stronger predictor of adult health outcomes. I should mention here just briefly that the error bars here represent one standard error of each estimate in case you're statistically oriented, and the stars above the bars represent the statistical significance of the difference in the association across the two samples. So we are seeing a statistically significant difference in the strength of the association across the two samples. Okay, so is this something fundamental about how childhood disadvantage is getting under the skin to influence health, or is this somehow operating through adult status attainment? So when I say adult status attainment, I mean adult education and adult income levels. So we wanted to consider whether this difference over time was really accounted for when we adjust for adult status, to see whether it's operating through these variables. So on the left side here is the results that I already just showed you. So the strength, and that's the strength of the associations before adjusting for adult status. And on the right side is the strength of the association after adjusting for adult status. So what we can see is that the height of the overall bars is reduced, but more importantly, the difference between the bars is also reduced. So what we're really focusing on here is the difference between the bars less after adjusting for adult status than it was before adjusting for adult status. And it turns out that it is. On average, across the four health outcomes, about 50% of the difference across the two samples was accounted for after we adjusted for adult status. So it does seem that this change in the strength of the association between childhood disadvantage and adult health is a substantial portion of that change in the association seems to be operating through adult status attainments. But the next question is why that might be. So is it the case that childhood disadvantage is becoming a stronger predictor of adult status? Is it more difficult to obtain higher levels of education if you start at the bottom? If you're born into a family at the bottom, is it more difficult to obtain higher levels of education than it used to be? Or similarly for income, is it more difficult to move up the income distribution than it used to be? Also, it could also be on the other side here. So it could be changes in the strength of the association between adult status and health outcomes. So is it that childhood disadvantage is becoming a stronger predictor of adult status, or is it that adult status is becoming a stronger predictor of health? So as we become more technologically advanced as a society, it may be that more and more educational attainment is required in order to navigate the healthcare system, in order to fully understand all of the ways that one might be able to improve one's health through nutrition and physical activity. It could also be the case that there are more ways to invest in one's own health. From foods to nutritional supplements to navigating different types of physical activity, all of these things have kind of dollar signs associated with them in terms of what's available. So it could be that both education and income are becoming a stronger predictor of health. So we wanted to address both of these possibilities. So to start with, we looked at whether the effects of childhood disadvantage on adult status attainment had changed over time. So here's what we found. In terms of the association between childhood disadvantage and adult income, we did find some evidence that association had become stronger in 2012 than it was in 1995. For education, we didn't find any significant difference. So it does seem that it seems to be harder to move, at least based on the MIDAS data and this particular analysis, it does seem to be slightly harder to move up the income distribution than it used to be. We didn't find any differences for educational attainment. So this doesn't mean that childhood disadvantage isn't predicting educational attainment. It is. It's predicting it quite strongly. It's just that we're not finding evidence that that link has become stronger over time for education. So the next step here is to focus on the right side. Is adult status becoming a stronger predictor of health outcomes? And for both income and education, we found consistent evidence across all four outcomes that is the case. So it does seem that high levels of income are becoming more and more strongly associated with adult health outcomes, and the same for education. So overall, what we're finding here is that childhood disadvantage is indeed becoming a stronger predictor of adult health, and a substantial portion, about half of these effects, seem to be operating through adult status attainments. So these findings are consistent with other recent research on this topic. So this is a recent study which looked at socioeconomic disparities in health among adults over time. So just in this period between 2001 and 2014, this study showed substantial increases in the social class gradient in health in the United States. So in 2001, the gap in life expectancy between the top 25% and the bottom 25% was 4.3 years. By 2014, that gap in life expectancy had increased to 6 years. So even in that short period of time, the magnitude in health, the kind of difference in life expectancy between income groups has increased substantially. If we look at other studies conducted earlier, we can actually estimate that back in the 1980s, that gap in life expectancy between the top and the bottom was something closer to 3 or 3.5 years. So it does seem like socioeconomic disparities in health have increased across the past several decades. So more work is needed to further explore the mechanisms for these effects that I've shown you. But it will also be important to examine lots of other changes in society that might be occurring with rising income inequality. So as the top 20% continue to pull away from the rest of society, another important consideration is the role of elitism, classism, and social class discrimination. So in social psychology, there's a phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the human tendency to attribute the failings of others to intrinsic internal characteristics of the individual rather than external situational causes. And there's also a tendency to attribute one's own failings to external causes. So this is kind of self-protective in a way, right? But as the gap between the top and everybody else increases, it's possible that those at the top are starting to see their position as somehow just completely deserved and natural, such that they're seeing, and also that as they look at those who have been more stagnant and haven't improved in their household incomes over the last several decades, it's possible that they're starting to blame others for their own lack of progress. So as we see these that worlds are overlapping less and less, and the top 20% are increasingly living more affluent lives that are separate from everyone else, it's possible that elitism and classism and social class discrimination could be kind of playing a substantial role in how people are treating each other. Okay, so the research question that we wanted to focus on relating to this topic is, to what extent are social class differences in health across the lifespan explained by experiences of unfair treatment? So this time, instead of looking at 2 independent random samples, we looked at one sample that was followed over time in the MIDAS study across 3 waves of data collection. So the original MIDAS cohort was recruited in 1995 with this broad age range of adults. This sample was followed, a follow-up was conducted 9 years later, and again 9 years after that. So we used all 3 waves of this data to test this question of, is the social class gradient in health across the lifespan, to what extent is that accounted for by experiences of unfair treatment and discrimination? So the social class gradient in health is well established. So it's not going to be surprising that we see that socioeconomic disadvantage is associated with faster declines in health across the lifespan. But the key question we're focusing in on here is, to what extent is that social class gradient operating through, to what extent does it seem to be operating through these experiences of unfair treatment and discrimination? So here is the social class gradient. Not surprisingly, those who started out more socioeconomically disadvantaged did indeed have faster declines in their self-rated health over this 18-year period of adulthood. Also, those who were less advantaged socioeconomically were much more likely to report having experienced unfair treatment in the workplace and in everyday life. So these 2 measures of unfair treatment, one focusing on workplace unfair treatment and the other focusing on more general, everyday unfair treatment, both of them were reported at much higher levels among those who were less or among those who are more disadvantaged. Also, these high levels of unfair treatment were associated in turn with faster declines in self-rated health across the lifespan. So of all of the ways that your social class or your socioeconomic status is influencing your health, based on these analyses, it seems like approximately 20% of that overall social class gradient seem to be operating through these experiences of unfair treatment and discrimination. So the result of this study combined with other research on this topic to suggest that social class-related unfair treatment is one important factor to consider when examining health inequality. So much more work is needed to replicate and extend these findings across contexts and using objective health measures. It will also be important to bring to light the different forms that social class discrimination might take. So most work on unfair treatment and discrimination has focused on the context of race. So the first thing that people think of when you talk about discrimination is racial and ethnic discrimination, and that's obviously a very important topic of study as well. But in the context of social class, there's less awareness both among researchers and among the general public of what types of forms social class discrimination might take. So I think it's going to be important moving forward to begin to sort of unpack what that looks like. What are all of the various forms that social class discrimination might be taking in our society? So I think it'll be important for maybe qualitative studies to really dig into and uncover what are the various ways that this is playing out in people's everyday lives. It will also be important as this understanding develops to raise public awareness around the role of elitist attitudes and social class discrimination in everyday life. And also, as this knowledge grows as a whole, to begin to address directly the elitist ideologies that underlie the actual unfair treatment itself and its occurrence. So more broadly, it will be essential to continue to closely monitor social inequality, health disparities, and the life chances of individuals across the social class hierarchy. So fundamental to this country is the concept of the American dream and the idea that this is not a country of birthright, but instead a country where anyone with hard work and determination can pursue their dreams and have a real chance of success. So making these ideals more of a reality will not be easy and will require overcoming many obstacles. There are obviously many challenges that we face today in terms of making this more of a reality. But even with all the challenges that we face, there are ways in which positive change is definitely possible. So I think it's important to stay positive here and focus on what is possible. So in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we must not accept infinite disappointment. We must accept infinite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. So I'll end there. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.